Thank you, everyone. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to recognize that we're on the traditional territory of the Staminas First Nation. For over 5,500 years, the Staminas people have been the stewards and shepherds of this land, and I know that we're all very thankful to be here. So climate change, it's obviously a very big issue to all of you in this room and to myself personally. I think we're at the point now where we've reached that tipping point that people understand that this is not a theory, but it's in reality. In Ladysmith, we see it, and especially over the last 3 years, we've seen it with drought conditions that have gone on longer than we've had on recorded record. So although our precipitation remains the same, we don't have the snowfalls that we used to, which act as natural storage to provide us ample drinking water for our population and other activities, agriculture and other things. The other side of that is in the winters we get heavier stream flows than we're used to, so our fish habitats suffer. We see washouts on culverts, we see fish habitat damaged by heavy flows that are not typical, that would usually fall as snow in the winter, now fall as heavy and repeated rains. So now we're actually at the local level having to plan and build infrastructure for these kinds of issues that were usually taken care of by what's often termed as natural infrastructure, the natural systems that support our communities, our livelihoods, and all of the nature that is around us. So now we invest heavily when we do community plannings in calculating sea level rise or looking at stream flows. When we do development, we have to take a keener eye and spend more money to ensure that the environment is protected and preserved. So these are very real issues that affect us every day in our personal lives, not on some fictitious level that the summers are a little bit warmer and drier, but every single day of our lives in our hometown are affected by sea level rise, by climate change. So it's a very important issue. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Your commitment to showing up to an event like this shows that you understand that, and you're like me, wanting to learn more and to see what we can do as individuals and as communities to be more resilient to climate change, but also what we can do in our daily lives to combat climate change. I know I drive my little electric car, I work on my little solar projects, and I have turned it into a hobby, if you will. But that's probably not a hobby that most of us should be looking to have, is combating climate change. I'm proud to do that. I think that for me it's a motivator. I think stewardship of our planet is not just an environmental issue, but it's an economic issue as well. So for the livelihoods of all of us, I'm glad that you're here today, and I'm glad to be part of this. I'll be hosting and moderating tonight, so when we get up to the question and answer periods, if we can be respectful and save our questions to the appropriate times throughout the evening, we'll all get an opportunity to ask our experts, and we hope we enjoy a good and informative evening. So thank you for coming, and with that, I would like to introduce a very important and inspirational person to me. Not only politically, but personally. I've had the great opportunity before I was elected, and even more so since I was elected, to attend town halls where Elizabeth has spoken, have opportunities to have quiet moments to talk about not only political life, but the things that are important to both of us. And those things include climate change, our environment, and our economy and the social welfare of all of us. Climate change affects all of these things, and there's no better representative who would work harder, more effectively, speak more eloquently or intelligently than Elizabeth May. So I'm very proud to introduce our first speaker, Elizabeth May.
Thank you. I'm also really pleased to see so many of you here tonight to talk about climate change. I'm really pleased that we have Professor Jeff Lewis here with us from University of Victoria, who just told me that his thesis supervisor for his PhD was my friend Andrew Weaver, who is both a scientist as well as being the leader of the BC Green Party. So climate politics and climate science are really quite closely connected these days, because we need more people in politics who understand climate and understand the science. For me, I learned my climate science when I was the senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of the Environment in the Mulroney administration. That long ago, it became a top issue for Environment Canada. I worked there from 1986 to 1988. I wasn't political then, I wasn't a member of a party, so I wasn't a progressive conservative. When the minister was trying to convince me to come work for him, it was quite funny actually. I was an environmental lawyer. I've been known for working on pesticide issues in Atlantic Canada. My family's from Cape Breton, so I've worked for a long time on forest pesticide issues. And I went to law school. Anyway, somehow the Minister of Environment, Tom McMillan, who was from Prince Edward Island, so of course that colored that, you know, where I was known for working on issues was right nearby where he was from. So he was trying to convince me to come work in his office, and he ended up saying, I said to him, well, you know, because it took me quite by surprise that they'd want me to come be a senior policy advisor in the federal government. And I said, well, you know, I'm not a Tory. And he said, oh, I didn't think you were. But he said, you're not anything else, are you? And I said, no, I'm not anything else. He said, okay, fine, and that won't be a problem. So I had the great good fortune to learn climate science from the leading government scientists before the myth of doubt had been invented. So I learned climate science when it was as complicated to say putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will disrupt the climate, disrupt the will cause global warming. It was about as complicated as saying adding salt to water will make salt water. Was not put forward to me or the minister at the time as a theory or as controversial. It's just what was. And at the time, of course, 86 to 88, and this was after the U.S. Academy of Sciences had advised the government of former President Jimmy Carter that this was a future risk. So when I learned climate science, it was also described as a future risk, because they were looking at if we keep burning fossil fuels at the level at which we are burning them, and if we keep destroying our forests at the level that we are destroying them, we will see, I can remember the we will sees, we will see glaciers shrinking by the year 2030. So where we heard predictions and explanations of what was going to happen, they were outpaced by events. Both because we started burning more fossil fuels than we were burning in 1986, and because the large computer models that were being used to also anticipate what would happen with more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere hadn't quite factored in some other complications. For instance, positive feedback loops. Our Arctic ice at the poles is shrinking much faster, the Arctic North Pole, shrinking much faster than the computer models had anticipated, because they hadn't factored in what's called the albedo effect and losing albedo effect. How many of you already know what I'm talking about? Quite a few, but not everybody. So the ice at the poles, being white, actually functions to cool the whole planet. When the sun's radiated heat strikes ice, being white, it bounces back off to space. This is why we wear white clothing in summer. It's science. It keeps us cooler. If you're wearing dark clothing, dark absorbs heat. It can help keep you warmer. White will keep you cooler. So the ice at the top of the poles bounces heat back. The dark ocean water absorbs that heat. So what started happening is, as we lost ice from the levels of climate change that were able to be modeled from global warming as we anticipated it from warmer ocean waters, as the ice shrunk, the dark ocean water pulled more heat, speeding up the heating of the ocean water, speeding up the melting of the ice. And so that's called a positive feedback loop. It's anything but positive, but it's what happens. And another one that's also related to the circumpolar north, and it was first pronounced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that climate change had arrived and was happening. One of the sort of canary in the coal mine moments, and it was in, I think, about the mid-90s, but Jeff can correct me because I'm going by memory, was noting that permafrost melt was happening quite rapidly, and that the Yukon and Northwest Territories in Canada were experiencing warming temperatures 3 times faster than the global average, and that as the permafrost melted, and you think about it, this is intuitive, we think about permafrost, what is it? It's permanently freezing something that's like a muskeg, and muskeg is swampy, and that means it's got methane gas. So when you start warming up the permafrost, you start releasing a lot of methane, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So there's another positive feedback loop. Forest fires, another positive feedback loop. Warmer, drier, hotter temperatures provoke more forest fires and also more insect threats, and that leads to losing the carbon in the standing forest. That was, of course, the first big economic climate impact for Canada was in this province when we lost cold snaps in the winter and the interior lodgepole pine forest was consumed by an indigenous pest, not unusual, but the pine beetle it was usually knocked back by one cold snap in winter, would keep the pine beetle outbreaks under control. Without cold snaps in winters in BC, we had a huge economic hit because we lost those forests, which means we lost the resource for mill towns. It was a multi-billion-dollar loss, and at that time, our premier was Gordon Campbell, and I think that's one reason that Gordon Campbell was out front. I mean, we wouldn't have before this said, gee, we have a really, small g green premier. It wasn't something you associated with his party or him personally. But he said right off the bat that the loss of our lodgepole pine forest was a climate change impact, and within a very short period of time, he brought forward Canada's first carbon tax, and it worked really well till Christy Clark put the brakes on it, but it's a well-designed thing. So back to where we are on climate science. All of the things that I was warned about by government scientists in the mid-'80s have been occurring, but faster and with greater severity than we thought would happen in the 1980s. In 1992, Canada was quite in the lead in the Rio Earth Summit negotiations for the Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is still the treaty under which we are negotiating everything we negotiate on climate. So Kyoto in 1997 and Paris in 2015 these are all meetings that are annual, held under the framework of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which Canada and every other country on Earth signed and ratified fast. Canada was the first industrialized country to sign and ratify the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But we didn't take the actions that were called for under that agreement. It didn't have deadlines, it didn't have timelines, it didn't have targets. At the time, by the way, US President George Bush, the first one, said that if the Framework Convention on Climate Change for Rio included deadlines and targets, he wouldn't sign it. So that's why it was vague. But that meant the US is still a party to this convention. That's why right now Barack Obama has already ratified the Paris Agreement, and he didn't need to take it to the Senate to get a ratification there because we structured in the negotiations. Paris Agreement was structured to be, acknowledging that the US had already ratified the Framework Convention on Climate Change, so it didn't, we made sure the language didn't hit any tripwires that would require it going to the US Senate for a ratification vote. That's why the US never ratified Kyoto. You need to have 2/3 vote in the US Senate to ratify a treaty. This one was negotiated carefully so that the US President could ratify it by executive order within the Framework Convention on Climate Change that George Bush had already ratified. Anyway, probably getting into too many details. But it's been a busy year for climate action globally, but we're nowhere near achieving what needs to be done. And where Canada showed real leadership, I was very pleased to be part of the Canadian government delegation to COP21 in Paris. I can tell you that I would have been there anyway. I've been at climate negotiations, most of them since they started. Because under the previous administration, under Stephen Harper, for the first time ever, we had government delegations that refused to include opposition members of parliament. So the other opposition parties sadly stopped going. I kept going. I went to the climate negotiation in Durban. First time I went as an elected member of parliament. I was so pleased to go as an elected member of parliament. And I went there fully credentialed to go into every back room and help with the negotiations as a member of the government delegation of Papua New Guinea. Couldn't get on my own government delegation. And I went to the one in Warsaw. This time I didn't have to ask a government to take me. They actually asked for my help because they were short-staffed. For Warsaw, which was COP19, I was a member of the delegation of the government of Afghanistan. This was all kind of weird. So I'm really pleased that Justin Trudeau redressed this childish, undiplomatic, and uncharacteristic treatment of members of parliament by a government and by the Prime Minister. And so for Paris, I was a full member of the government delegation, and I worked really closely with our Minister for Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna. She had never been to one of these before. I mean, I'm not saying anything against her, it's just how it was. She had had no experience in one of these before, and I'm glad I was there to work with her because I've been to a lot of them. She did a great job. Honest to goodness, she worked super hard. She was tapped by the president of the COP. Now these are titles you've probably never heard, president of the COP. The COP is the conference of the parties, and the parties are every country that signed and ratified the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the Conference of the Parties is the name for each of these meetings. And the president of COP is generally either the Minister of Environment or Minister of Foreign Affairs from the country that's hosting. So Laurent Fabius was the president of the COP in Paris. He's France's Minister for Foreign Affairs. He's genius. I think if he had chaired, for those of you who are climate policy wonks and you remember the disaster of Copenhagen, if we had had the same team in 2009 in the same city with the same determination from the host country in 2009, if we'd had Paris in 2009 instead of Copenhagen, we would have had a treaty then. Laurent Fabius, it makes a difference, these questions of does the country that's hosting the meeting want you to succeed or not? And Denmark was complicated. I won't get into it, but something was really rotten in the state of Denmark. We'll move on from Shakespearean references. So Laurent Fabius, as president of COP in Paris, decided that to make everything work, he picked 7 really tough issues that were described as cross-cutting, and picked 14 ministers for each of these 7 issues, one from an industrialized country, one from a developing country, to tag team and co-chair a process to come to consensus on 7 tough issues. And Catherine McKenna, who'd never been to one of these before, was one of the people tapped to do this. These meetings, by the way, she said to me afterwards, nobody warned me. I said, they should have told you. They're 24 hours straight. You go round the clock. So Catherine McKenna was chairing in a room where the negotiations would get into high gear at midnight and break at 5 a.m. So whenever I see something in the media about how the minister or any of us were having fun in Paris, whoa, so not true. So the Paris Agreement is better than it was expected to be. James Hansen, one of the world's leading scientists, before the Paris Agreement opened, he said it won't succeed because it's only going to go to 2 degrees and we need 1.5. Well, thanks to Canada, we went to 1.5. The treaty text was much more ambitious than anyone expected, and the first country from the industrialized world to get up and say, we want the treaty language to say that we have to hold to no more than a 1.5 degree increase was Canada. Now I have to say what 1.5 means because it's a very complicated, overly wordy target, and it's real hard to describe. The Paris Agreement says that the world will strive to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius what it was before the Industrial Revolution. And at no cost should we let it go above 2. So there's a range. There's a strive for 1.5 and avoid going over 2 degrees. Now the reason this is a complicated target, and I've heard a lot of national news media, I can't believe how many people who actually are supposed to be reliable sources of information in this country who will ask questions about the 2%. No, we're talking about degrees, and we're talking about a specific concept, global average temperature, which is not like your daily temperature. So in a country like Canada, where those of us who've ever lived in, as I have, Nova Scotia or Ontario, you know that in the summer you can be, on occasion, plus 40. In the winter, on occasion, you're certainly minus 30, sometimes minus 40. So you've got huge temperature swings. So what does 2 degrees mean in that context? And it's really important to create some context around this. In terms of global average temperature, 2 degrees is huge. The difference in global average temperature between now in Canada in 2016 and 10,000 years ago in the last ice age, where there were several kilometers of ice over most of Canada, the difference in global average temperature is 5 degrees. 1 degree is huge. 2 degrees is not a safe zone at all. 1.5 isn't a safe zone either, but if we can hold global average temperature at 1.5, we have a really good chance that the low-lying island states of the planet will not go under. So for countries that are in the negotiations in the UN, by the way, UN negotiations are by consensus. So even the little tiny countries can stand up against the US or the People's Republic of China. So countries like Tuvalu and the Seychelles, Maldives, Fiji, Nauru, little tiny countries can stand up and say, you've got to hold to 1.5 or our children have no future because we're underwater. 1.5 is also really important to avoid losing the Greenland ice sheet. We don't know whether the Greenland ice sheet will stay in place at 1.5. We don't even know for sure if we'll lose it at 2 degrees. We do know that if we lose the Greenland ice sheet, or for that matter the Western Antarctic ice sheet, the impact on sea level rise will be 8 meters for each one of them. Let that sink in, because that's not something you hear very much. So it's really critical that in face of some scary, scary possibilities, we hang on to the positive and to the really good news that we negotiated something, and when I say we, I mean Canada. We made a difference. Canada was in the lead to ensure that the language that came out of the Paris Agreement gives us half a hope of getting through this without losing human civilization, without low-lying island states going underwater, without basically spiraling into chaos. We've got a good chance if we seize it. But there's nothing in the Paris Accord that guarantees we're going to avoid the scary stuff. The Paris Accord gives us a chance. And the way it's structured, instead of having targets and timelines embedded in the treaty the way they were in Kyoto, the targets and timelines have all been tabled with the UN system at the Secretariat for Climate, which is in Bonn, Germany. And the treaty terms say at any time, any country can pull out the target they've tabled, only to put in a tougher one. That's critical. It's a principle of ratcheting up, and we have to do it fast. The only enforcement mechanism in the Paris Agreement is basically global shaming and peer pressure. There are no enforcement mechanisms in the Paris Agreement, but there were no enforcement mechanisms in Kyoto either. So we have to use the peer pressure global shaming process in order to get ratcheting up the targets so we can avoid 1.5 and 2. Now, on current targets of all the countries that have filed their targets with the UN system, which is most every country, you add them all up, say, okay, what if every government on Earth fully achieves their promises for reducing greenhouse gases that they have tabled with the UN? Every country hits their target. Do we avoid 1.5? Do we avoid 2? Absolutely not. This is the scary part. This is where we must be much more active. Right now, on all the aggregate of targets, if achieved, take us to between 2.7 degrees Celsius and 3.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this was known before we went to Paris. I got into it was terrible, actually. I got in real trouble with Power and Politics because I was trying to explain this, and the host only wanted to keep saying, but Stéphane Dion says the whole thing's going to fail. Stéphane Dion keeps saying that you're going to go to 3.5. So I say, listen, it's because that's the current aggregate. That's what everybody knows. That's why we have to have ratcheting up. We have to have tougher targets. So you can both understand that this is true. On current total promises of every country on Earth, we blow right by the goals of the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement is about an architecture and a system and a process for improving our targets continually. So Canada needs to improve our target, and soon. Right now, the target that Canada tabled with the UN system is the one that was tabled in May 2015, You'll recall our election was in October 2015. This target was tabled in May 2015 by former Environment Minister Leona Aglukkaq. It is the weakest target in the G7. It's much weaker than Barack Obama's target. That is still the only target that Canada has tabled. And I'm pushing as hard as I can to get Justin Trudeau and his administration to put in a tougher target. But they've also done, and it's a good thing to do, I'm not critical, it's absolutely critical that the climate plan for Canada be negotiated in concert with all the provinces and territories. That process is being run by the inner civil servants of all the provinces, territories, and the federal government. And the terms of reference for those negotiations says we have to achieve, and then they list the Harper target, which is 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. So I'm always willing to accept any invitation, anywhere that I can get to talk about climate action. Because this is complicated stuff. As a person who leads the Green Party of Canada, I am not going to slam Justin Trudeau for what he has or hasn't done so far. He's done way more than anything we've seen for the last 10 years. But we also need to know that to get him to do the right thing, he needs to be pushed. He needs to understand that you can't approve the Kinder Morgan pipeline and hit your climate targets. He has to understand that you can't ignore the fact that Canada's current target was the one put in place by Stephen Harper, and it's too weak to come close to what we promised to do in Paris. So this is something of the framework of the politics of the moment. Catherine McKenna, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, will be meeting with provincial counterparts and territorial counterparts once again, face-to-face, October 3rd in Montreal. And I'm deathly afraid, I don't mind telling you, I'm deathly afraid that the resistance from provinces like Saskatchewan and Brad Wall, who in today's Globe and Mail is attacking Trudeau for his promise to ratify the Paris Accord. Brad Wall, I tell people, and I hope you don't mind my sharing this with you, but I tell you, anytime you try to talk to the Premier of Saskatchewan, you might as well be talking to a Brad Wall. That guy could have a different first name and it could be Brick. Fortunately, there's only one Premier who is that intransigent. For the first time ever, we have an Alberta Premier who's on board. Her climate plan is not close to enough. But it's the first time in decades that we've had, and in the whole negotiations around climate, we haven't had an Alberta Premier who was on board. We went from Ralph Klein to Alison Redford, and then, Jim Prentice was one of the better environment ministers under Harper, for sure. But Rachel Notley is by far the most enlightened Alberta Premier we've had in decades and decades. Peter Lougheed was great, by the way. But this is a big moment for Canada to have an Alberta Premier who's ready to take climate action, even though her plan is far too weak. So right now, though, the pressures against climate action are large. We really need to pull back the 30% below 2005 by 2030 target, to have a target, and one of the reasons it's not just domestic targets that matter, it's how does Canada push the US to have a better target? How does Canada push China to do more? We do by leading by example. We need to push the European Union. The European Union, by the way, is miles ahead of us because they met all their Kyoto targets. Our current target, I'm going to go on too long about targets and I need to turn it over to Jeff. But our current target, if you compare to Europe, the Europeans kept the base year of 1990, which has been in the Framework Convention on Climate Change and in Kyoto. It's Harper that screwed up base years by starting playing with them, and then the US followed what Canada was doing, and now it's very hard to compare targets because the base years shift around. So instead of everything being measured against 1990 levels, we're playing around with against 2005 levels and for well against 2006 levels. But just to give you a sense of it, if you convert Canada's target to the year 2030 to 1990 levels, we'd be 16% below 1990 levels by 2030. The European Union's target is to be 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. Okay, by comparison, you can see how far behind we are. And those are targets that the European Union will meet, but they still need to be more ambitious because the aggregate total take us to a place that is beyond dangerous. It's catastrophic. So my good news piece is between glass half full and glass half empty from Paris. My view is it's either glass half full. If we failed in Paris, it'd be glass smashed all over the floor because we weren't going to ever be able to go back and ask a full meeting of 192 countries at a UN meeting to come up with a climate plan. This was our last chance, and we did really well. So now we have the tools to avoid disaster. The question is, will we pick them up and use them? Thank you.